ranking. So this is something we did last week on the mailbag show because one of the viewers asked me to rank just based on resume. And we put it out on Twitter the next day with a clip and got a pretty good response there because there's a lot of people who like it, who want you to rank teams like this. They want you to say, I don't care what the preseason hype was. I don't care what happened last year. I just want you to go based on what we've seen so far. And I think it's a very instructive way to do it. And I still think you always end up at the same place as everybody else. You can start this way and have somebody else start the more traditional way. By the end of the season, your picks are going to look fairly similar. But this was an awful, awful exercise this week. This was so hard because teams have been so inconsistent and we have so few data points and still so few Power 5 on Power 5 games that it made it almost impossible. Plus, you had clunkers from teams that were at the top of this last week, and I wanted to move them down, but there was nobody to move them down in favor of. I didn't even know who else to put up there. So that was part of the problem. So we can start at the top of the rankings. Texas is still there. And I know what you're thinking. If you watched the first 3 quarters of the Wyoming game, you're like, what in the world is Texas still doing here? Why would you keep Texas at number 1? First of all, the Alabama win looks worse. And second of all, they were tied with Wyoming after 3 quarters. The only thing I can say is the explosion in the fourth quarter, which allowed them to win 31-10, was very impressive. The Alabama win is still very impressive. We'll see what the difference is between Alabama, Jalen Milroe, and Alabama, Ty Simpson / Tyler Buchner actually is when they play Ole Miss. We may see Milroe again. So it may help us evaluate where Texas is at with that win. But I'm going to leave that there. They look very impressive. Number 2, Florida State. Now, I thought about potentially moving Florida State up to number 1 because of what LSU did to Mississippi State. It makes Florida State's win against LSU look all that much more impressive. The problem was Florida State went up to Chestnut Hill and struggled with Boston College. And we talked on Saturday about why that is. And in the specific circumstances here, again, it was the red bandana game. That's the one that Boston College does to honor Wells Crowther, who's a former Boston College athlete. He was a trader who worked in one of the towers on 9/11. He was also a volunteer firefighter. He saved 18 people's lives before losing his own. And it's one of those things where Boston College comes out of the gate and plays really hard. And that opponent is in for a challenge when they have to come in and play in that game. So I knew that was going to be tough for Florida State. Plus, you have the look-ahead factor. They're playing Clemson next week. It was probably predestined. The only thing I can say is I think this is a game that last year's Florida State team would have lost, and they didn't. So I think I can keep them there. I don't feel that bad about keeping them there. I brought this one in. This is a team. We only did a top 5 last week. We're doing a top 10 this week. I've got Utah number 3. Now, Utah's Baylor game was not pretty. It was they barely won. They needed a drive at the end of the game to win the game. But what they did to Florida looks much more impressive in light of what Florida did to Tennessee. So I'm going to give Utah the benefit of the doubt. And again, Utah's been playing with a lot of backups. As more people get healthy, they're probably going to get better. But we'll have a very good idea where Utah's at after they play UCLA this weekend. So it may be Utah stays here. Maybe Utah moves up. Maybe UCLA moves in because they beat Utah. We will find out. Next one, another Pac-12 team. I don't know that Michigan State is all that good. But what Washington did to Michigan State was so impressive. And Michigan State was 2-0 going to that game. Now, granted, it was Western Michigan and Richmond. Or no, Central Michigan and Richmond. But that was as thorough an annihilation as you're going to see. Washington looks like they can play with anybody. So I've got them there. 5, Duke. Duke dismantled Northwestern. We've seen what Duke did to Clemson. I'm excited to see what Mike Elko does with this team this year. Riley Leonard's awesome. 6, I've got Notre Dame. I don't know how good the NC State win is. I'll be perfectly honest with you here, but they've been fairly dominant in all their games, and so I'm going to leave. I left Notre Dame in the ranking. I dropped them a tad because I put Utah in there and it bumped, and I put Washington in there and it bumped people down. But here's the thing: if Notre Dame beats Ohio State, they're going to be 1 in this ranking next week. If they lose to Ohio State, we'll see where we put them. It all depends on how the game goes. I'm not going to be one of those people, though, if you lose by 1 to a team that's supposed to be awesome, that I drop you way down in the rankings. You may stay exactly where you are, because I never saw the logic in doing that. I never saw the logic in dropping a team that lost to a team that it allegedly was supposed to lose to. And I believe Ohio State's a slight favorite here. So we'll see how that game goes. But that's what Notre Dame has a chance to move to number 1. Number 7, Miami. Again, I don't know exactly how good the Texas A&M win it was. Texas A&M looked smooth again against an overmatched opponent on Saturday, but we will have a chance to see what Texas A&M can do as they get into conference play. Miami will get into conference play. We'll have a much better idea. Number 8, I've got Colorado. I don't know that the Colorado State win does anything. TCU, the team that Colorado beat in week 1, did go win its Big 12 opener at Houston. It was kind of touch and go for a minute, but then TCU turned on the Jets. Nebraska, the other team that Colorado beat, did win its first game. Well, notched its first win against Northern Illinois. Number 9, North Carolina. I've tinkered with the idea of putting North Carolina higher. They've got the win against South Carolina. You saw how South Carolina played against Georgia. South Carolina played very well against the Bulldogs for definitely the first half. It got to where they couldn't hang anymore in the middle of the third quarter. But we all assume that Georgia is going to make the college football playoff. Georgia's the prohibitive favorite in the SEC. So the fact that that's the team that North Carolina beat, looking pretty good, that obviously makes North Carolina look pretty good. Now, they barely beat Appalachian State, but they still beat them. And that's a program that has been historically pretty good. You've also got Minnesota. Came into Chapel Hill, and North Carolina had it wasn't easy per se, but they made it look kind of easy. So very impressed with Mac Brown's team. It's much more complete than last year's, which, by the way, won its division of the ACC and played for the ACC title. So very impressed with them so far. Number 10, Penn State. The West Virginia win looking better because West Virginia won the backyard brawl, but the Illinois win, I thought it was not perfect. Offensively, they kind of messed around a little bit. Johnny Newton did have a great game for Illinois. You heard him, the law firm, Johnny Newton, Keith Randolph, the 2 defensive tackles. You heard them earlier when we were at Big Ten Media Days on this show. That's a good tandem. Penn State struggled a little bit with them. So when they play better defensive lines, I'm now a little bit worried. But they still really controlled that game with their defense. And so I'm having that at 10. And then you're going to say, where's Georgia? Where's Ohio State? Where's USC? Where's Michigan? Well, they all have their chance to play their way into this. But the problem is they haven't really gotten to play anybody of consequence yet. Ohio State, we'll see what they look like against Notre Dame, but they certainly be in here. Georgia, they don't have really the super marquee opponent, although we'll see where Florida is, where Tennessee is, and they play them. But Georgia is getting going now. Georgia gets into SEC play, and we'll see a little bit more from them and have a better idea of where they land on this deal. But they'll all get in there eventually. Alabama may get it back in there eventually. We'll see, because they got to figure out their quarterback situation, and it is a mess. I just think it's stunning. I'm not used to seeing this from Nick Saban coach teams. I don't think anybody else is either. And so I don't know what happens next year. Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples On 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.